My name is Zoe Allnutt. I have a studio called Nuttshell and I like to be called a designer. This is my photo that I've brought in, which is a unique historic document. It's a photo of the year of 1972 at Swinburne, which was then called Swinburne Technical College, I think. Nothing to do with universities. So this is the year that graduated, and you can see it's a fairly small year. Lots of blokes, lots of long hair. If they all stood up, there'd be lots of flares. And there is also a wonderful man called Bob Francis, who was our lecturer, who was inspirational. So my time at Swinburne was inspirational to me. I went to Swinburne after high school, and it was suggested to me at high school that I don't actually apply for university, because in those days everybody went to university if you got in, and my counsellor at school said, you want to do graphic design, just apply for Swinburne, which was close to where I lived. So I did, and in those days it was actually quite easy to get in. So I got into Swinburne, and you can see that I actually ended up graduating. So after that, actually between my second last year and final year, I had gained an English-speaking union exchange scholarship, which allowed me to go to London during our summer break. So that was really pivotal in my development as a designer. And I was given a job at an advertising agency in Berkeley Square in London as a young Australian, and it was amazing. And then I did a little bit of travel, and then I came back to Australia and finished my my course at Swinburne, and ended up with a diploma of art, and in brackets it says graphic design. So that's my qualifications. While I was in England, or in London over that time, I met a man who I fell in love with. So that's all very romantic. So after I finished my final year, having waitressed all year to save up enough money to go back again, I went back, and Michael, the man who I met that previous time, and I got married 6 months later. So I was very young, 22, which I would hate to think my daughter would ever do, and we got married, and I stayed for four more years in London working. I got a job in an amazing studio called Design Research Unit, which was fantastic. I worked on some major clients such as British Rail, the National Coal Board, just really high-profile design projects. And this studio was in a Piano and Renzo designed building, which was amazing, one of their very early buildings. And it was quite new in its attitude to design. They had graphic designers, interior designers and architects and industrial designers all under the same roof. So for instance, they did all the work for the Hong Kong Underground. So there were graphic designers such as myself working on all the graphics, the logos, all the type of graphics that go with such a project. There are industrial designers working on the designs of the trains. There are interior designers also working on the trains, as well as architects actually working on the stations. So it was that sort of real appreciation of the whole gamut of design and how each one talks to the other one, which I'm not sure whether there's that sort of linkage as much these days. After that, I got my dream job, which was at the British Museum. So I worked at the British Museum Design Office, designing exhibitions and associated publications and posters and all the rest of it for a couple of years, which was fantastic. And then I missed my mum. So I came back to Australia with my husband, and we've been here ever since. And when I came back to Australia, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, because I had this experience, but I didn't have the network in Australia to sort of just slot in. So I actually got a job teaching, which was quite useful because I got to know a lot of people through that role. So I worked at Phillip Institute, which then became RMIT, for quite a few years, as well as having children. So doing the teaching thing and having children was actually quite useful because I had that sort of hours that allowed me to have young children. So I had maternity leave when I had my first child, Zoe, then went back to teaching. Then I had maternity leave when I had my second child, Charlie. But I never went back to teaching because I just started getting busy doing my own freelance work while I was on maternity leave. So when it was time to decide what to do after the year off, I thought, my goodness, what am I going to do? I've got this great freelance work. Will I go back to teaching? And I actually made the decision not to go back to teaching, which was the most difficult decision ever, because there is something quite easy about the teaching life in that it's always there. You don't have to chase work or chase clients, you know. You're not running a business. But I decided, no, I was doing really interesting work. I was going to do the business side of things. So in 1985, I quit my fully tenured lecturing position and started Nuttshell. So that was it. And then I just started with one or two people helping me out, working. And we just got busier and busier. And then we bought a house or it was actually a pub in North Melbourne, which we turned into our house, which has a studio, or was a stable, in the backyard, as it were, which has its own entry, which was good. So I set up...
the Nutshells?
Oh yes, there's a great story about the Nutshells. The studio, which was the stable, when we had a look at this property, the whole property was derelict, but the studio was particularly derelict. But the one thing about it was that there were walnuts on the ground of this stable because the people who owned it imported walnuts from Italy. They were Italian and they had a wholesale grocer. So that was it. We had to be there. It was meant to be. So well, learning about the history of graphic design anywhere is important. It's important that you know where what you're doing comes from. You understand why we do it and the processes that people have gone through in the past to get to the point where we are now. Because although people sit down at a computer and do whatever they do, basically the end product is still the same as it was all those years ago when we were doing typesetting with hot metal and all the rest of it. It's still about communication and communicating clearly and succinctly and with flair and creativity. So you have to know how people have done that in the past, who they are. People like Pentagram, who are very influential to me, who are still going and still doing amazing things. In Australia, people like Brian Sadgrove and Gary Emery, who everybody should know about because they've set a certain Australian feel to the way we approach design. I think it's gutsy, it's colourful, it's bold, whereas I think British design is much more mannered and a bit quieter. And I think that's quite obvious when you look at the different iconic sort of designs that people refer to. The British are actually very good at senses of humour because the British have a wacky... everybody knows about the British sense of humour, and their graphic design also has a sense of humour, but it's much more mannered in a way, a bit Monty Python-esque and a bit crazy, whereas I think the Australian sense of humour is a little bit more backyard and in your face. So I think that's important to make people smile, and if you can make them laugh, even better. I guess by having a business, I've contributed through the number of people I've employed, so there have been a lot of people who've learnt and then grown and been able to go out to other industry places. They've started their own businesses, so that's an important element to my business. The other thing is the breadth of work that we do at Nuttshell. So we handle digital, print. We do a lot of three-dimensional work, which stems from my work at the British Museum. So that's quite unique in that we do that much signage and wayfinding, as well as all the other aspects of design. And so we've built up relationships with printers and with web technicians and with signage manufacturers and sculptors and so many people, and writers we do quite a lot of interpretive work, so we work with writers. So we have to understand what it is that we're communicating. So I think that breadth is probably the main thing, as well as the number of people that have gone through Nuttshell over the last 31 years. The focus being on the studio and the studio language, in that we really concentrate on the work being totally suitable for the client's needs. So, and I think that's a result of the way we look at the work and the way we deal with our clients. And the fact that we have clients who have been with us for so many years is a result of that caring and almost nurturing of our relationship with a client. So I think women are very good at creating those sort of relationships. I also think that I have a very family-friendly studio. I also think that I have a very worker-friendly studio. And the fact that my designers have been with Nuttshell for so long also helps with the relationships that we've built up with our clients. The work I did at Design Research Unit, I was fresh out of college, so I did a lot of other people's artwork, and I learned how to draw straight lines. Because in those days we didn't have computers and we had to use ruling pens. And they used to call me Straight Line Sue in jest, because I could never draw a straight line. So I learned a lot at Design Research Unit rather than being the designer. But then I got this fantastic job at the British Museum, and at the British Museum Design Office I worked as a graphic designer in partnership with an exhibition designer. So we designed exhibitions that were highlighting the collections of the museum or special exhibitions. So I designed the graphics in a new display about the Iranian and Anatolian rooms in the British Museum. And that involved understanding labelling, about information graphics, all that sort of thing. It was wonderful. So that informed when I came back to Australia. One of the first jobs I did was a big exhibition that was on at the National Gallery of Victoria called El Dorado Colombian Gold. So this was in 1977 or 78. And I worked with a three-dimensional designer who worked at the British Museum, and he was Australian and happened to come back to Australia at around the same time, and so we got to know each other. And I worked with him, David McCabe his name is. We also did quite a lot of work for the sesquicentenary of Victoria, which was happening at that time, the bicentenary of Australia in 1988, so that was after I came back. So all those things were all informed by the work that I did at the British Museum. And now at Nuttshell we're doing some amazing three-dimensional work.